thank you very much for inviting me here today to what is, for me, home turf. I grew up just literally 3 or 4 minutes away from here, so I'm ideally qualified to tell you that the weather is always like this in Ayrshire, as Ayrshire girls and guys amongst us will know all too well. So it's a real pleasure for me to be here today, and indeed to see so many familiar faces here in the audience. It's also particularly special for me to be here today talking about women in leadership, and particularly to be reflecting on women's leadership roles in business and in sport. And as I look around this room right now, I see many people who have first-hand experience of these subjects, particularly in business and in sport, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say later. But given the quite extraordinary month we've just experienced in the UK and indeed in Scotland, I thought it was probably quite appropriate to start with some reflections on women in politics, and to make reference to one of the many times in recent weeks where women leaders have been making the headlines. Last Friday, I stood on the steps of Bute House in Edinburgh to welcome the new Prime Minister of the UK, Theresa May. And politics aside, that image that went right around not just the UK but Europe and the world, of both of us as female leaders standing there as Prime Minister and First Minister, I hope sent a really positive message to girls and to young women, not just in Scotland but across the UK and further afield. And I hope that message was this one, that today in the 21st century we should no longer be prepared to accept glass ceilings. We should no longer be prepared to accept that there are certain jobs, certain careers, certain professions, certain levels of seniority that are out of our reach, that anything today that is possible for a man to aspire to in their professional life should equally be possible for a woman to aspire to. And on the principle, as the famous quote goes, that you can't be what you can't see, I think having role models, visible examples of women, whether in politics or in any other profession, that have made it to the top, can be transformational for instilling in younger women that sense that anything is and anything should be possible. So I think today in politics, and indeed as I'll talk about later in a number of other areas, there's a lot to be really positive about. As a woman today, there's much that we should be optimistic about and much that we should feel inspired by. But despite that, and there's always a but in these things, despite that, and in the interest of making sure the progress we're seeing now doesn't stall, that we continue to carry on and make further progress, it's also really important that we don't allow the success of some to blind us to or obscure the challenges of the many. Because the fact is, whether it's in politics or business or sport or any other walk of life, women in leadership roles are still too often the exception to the rule rather than being the rule. And actually, the position that Theresa May now finds herself in is a good way of illustrating that. Theresa is the second woman to hold the office of Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. There have, however, been 74 men who have held that office. So we might be making some progress, but I think we've got a long way to go before we can say we've achieved true gender equality. And of course, it is also the case that, and this is where politics perhaps is not unique, but what I'm about to say is particularly true of politics, women are still often treated differently to men in some of these positions. The picture of the Prime Minister and I on the steps of Bute House on Friday I've already referred to, but there was one news agency that will remain nameless that posted that picture, but with a bit of a difference. They cut us off at the knees in the picture. So the only thing in the picture that they circulated worldwide was actually a picture of the shoes that we were wearing. Now, if I may say so, we were both wearing particularly nice shoes. And I, as some of you will know, I'm a sucker for a nice pair of shoes, and I get the impression the Prime Minister also likes her shoes, something that we have in common, and given the differences between us, we should maybe hold on to the things we have in common. But notwithstanding the fact we were wearing nice shoes and we both like shoes, I suspect our shoes weren't the most notable things about the meeting we were having, and yet a respected global news agency thought that that was the most important thing about that picture. And then there was an interview I did down in London on the day Theresa May became Prime Minister, when I was asked live on television how my husband felt about the fact that I held a position of leadership. So we are making progress, but we've still got a long way to go. And you know, the fact that that question was asked of me by a woman journalist probably completely undermines what I'm about to say next. But one of the reasons why women in politics are, I think, still treated differently and talked about differently is that many of the people doing the commentating on women in politics are men. Now, we have, I'm glad to say, some fantastic and a growing number of fantastic women journalists, and without making her blush, Sarah Smith here, that we'll hear from later on, is a shining example of that. But when I sit in the Scottish Parliament doing First Minister's questions, and I glance up to, well, over that way, glance up to the media gallery, and no offence to the male journalists sitting at the back, but the majority of people looking down and reporting on politics are men. And if I can go slightly further than that, the majority, with an exception up the back, are middle-aged men. So the point I'm making here is that we're making progress, and it's great, but there is still a way to go. And I think the lesson of all of this is that we won't have true gender equality in politics or anywhere else until we achieve a critical mass of women in all sorts of different professions and all sorts of walks of life. So while it's fantastic to have a female First Minister, a female Prime Minister, a female Chancellor of Germany, hopefully, if I can be biased for a second, although in the circumstances we're in, it's hopefully not too outrageous to be biased in this way, hopefully soon a female President of the United States. It's not enough just to have women in those leadership positions. More important than having women in these positions are what the women in these positions then choose to do to support other women in the future. That's why it was important to me when I became First Minister to appoint a gender-balanced cabinet, to have an equal number of men and women in my cabinet, sitting around the table, taking the decisions that help to shape life for people right across the country. And why shouldn't we have a gender-balanced cabinet, given that women make up half the population, or actually slightly more than half of the population? So it's about what we do in these positions, not just about the symbolism of holding these positions. And that is true right across the spectrum in politics and elsewhere. In Scotland, we're fortunate to have a parliament that has many more women than most other parliaments across the world, although it was disappointing that the percentage of women in the Scottish Parliament actually stalled a bit at the last election, notwithstanding that some parties, my own and Labour, actually made great strides forward in terms of female representation. The Parliament overall as a whole didn't make that step forward. So that is another indicator that we've still got work to do. And we've still got that work to do whether we're talking about politics, business or sport. And it's important in all of these areas to look not just at who's in charge of the decisions, but who's taking part. Because, as I've said, we will only get more female leaders if there are more women participating overall. And if we look at business, again, we're seeing fantastic progress in representation at board level. The Davis Review into women on boards reported in 2015 that 26% of board members in FTSE 100 boards were women, and that was double the 12.5% who were board members in 2011. And as a result of that, the Davis report recommended upping the target to at least 33%. Well, that's good, that's progress, although I think 33% is still a little under-ambitious for my liking. We're also in Scotland seeing an improving picture when it comes to women in the workplace. We've got a higher female employment rate, lower female unemployment and female inactivity rate than the UK as a whole. And we've got a gender pay gap in Scotland that is far too high, but lower than it is in other parts of the UK. So there is progress, and this will be a constant theme of what I say today, progress that we should celebrate, but not progress that should make us complacent or think that the job is done. Talked about the gender pay gap. Sport in particular, as we know, has a particular gap when it comes to pay. If you look at the disparity in pay between the US women and men's football teams, women players get paid less when they win a major championship than men get paid just to take part, even if they go on to lose every single game that they play in. Now, we're seeing in sport, as elsewhere, a narrowing of the gap, but it's not yet enough, and it's not yet good enough. In sport, of course, as is the case elsewhere, it's about participation as the route to seeing more women in leadership roles. In sport, again, that gap is narrowing, but it's still harder to maintain girls' participation in sport when they get into their teenage years. 71% of 13 to 15-year-old boys take part in sport, but for girls that's only 56%. Again, at a leadership level, and again another theme of everything I will say, that we'll only make the real progress at leadership level when we're making real progress at other levels as well. But in sport, more women are taking on high-profile leadership roles, even in sports that are traditionally very male. So take football, for example. Anne Budge, now Chief Executive and Chair at Hearts, Leanne Dempster at Hibs, Shelley Kerr, manager of Stirling University Football Club, the first female manager of a team in the ranks of the Scottish League. Anne and Leanne, of course, are now also on the SPFL board, where together with Karen McCluskey, who's the non-executive director, they now make up a third of the board. So again, progress, but still work to do. And in sport, as in any other profession, role models really matter. That's why I'm such a supporter of the Scottish women's football team. I agreed to become their patron a few months ago because they're a fantastic group of women doing incredibly well, I have to say, although after I became patron and went to see them play in a match, up until the match I went to see, they were unbeaten in the European qualifiers. Unfortunately, the match I went to see them at, they lost to Iceland at Falkirk, so I'm not sure if I'm going to go back to see them. But nevertheless, fantastic women doing a lot to blaze a trail for women, not just in their own sport, but for women in all sports. So again, progress made, but more to do. And why does this matter? Because we talk about equality, and often we take for granted that equality is a good thing. And equality is a good thing. It's right and fair that women, who, as I say, make up more than half of the population, are equally represented and get an equal chance to shape the world we live in and participate in the world we live in. But the reason to promote gender equality is not just because it's a good thing to do and that it's right and fair. It's because it makes hard-headed economic sense as well. You know, there was a report published last year by McKinsey Global Institute, and what that report said is quite staggering. If we have greater gender equality, there will be $12 trillion added to the world's economy by 2025. Now, what exactly was that saying? What that said is that if every country was to use women's full economic and entrepreneurial potential to the same extent as the best performing country in their region, then the addition to the total global economy would be $12 trillion. That, just to put that in context, is equivalent to Germany, Japan and the UK's total GDP combined. So when you put it like that, it's not just a fair thing to do, it's a sensible and I would say essential thing to do. Why would you turn your back on that kind of economic advantage that is there for the taking if we just make our world, starting with our own country, a more equal place to do? And yet, even though we know that, and even though we're making progress, we still, as I keep saying, have more to do. So that, I think, is the key message for me to all of you today, is that yes, let's celebrate our progress, but let's resolve to do more to get even further down the road to equality. And what is that more that we need to do? Well, there's lots of things, and I'll touch on some of them as I go through the remainder of my remarks. But let me be clear, I also think one of the things we need to do, on occasion, in some circumstances, for a limited period of time, is embrace positive action. We often hear in response to that everything should be based on merit, and I believe things generally should be based on merit. But if it was the case that a meritocratic approach to dealing with gender inequality was the way to do it, it would have happened by now. The fact of the matter is it hasn't, because some of the barriers that we're facing have been generations in the making, and they're deeply embedded and deeply ingrained. Cultural attitudes, long-held beliefs, practical barriers, inbuilt inertia. These are the barriers we have to overcome. And sometimes to overcome these things and to do it in a way and in a time scale that's not going to take as long as it's taken for those barriers to become so ingrained, we need to give them a bit of help, which is why I do believe in the right circumstances, positive action has a role to play. We know what the barriers are. You know, there's this vicious circle where women can be excluded from leadership because they don't have the experience for it, but they can't get the experience until they can get into those positions. We've got skills gaps, women not having the right skills or the right training to get into IT or engineering or sciences, for example. But often that's because for generations we've been conditioned to believe that those are not the right career options for women to pursue. And I have to say there's the same for men in professions like childcare, for example. So this is not all about women, it's about breaking down gender stereotyping wherever we see it. There are economic constraints for women, the practicalities of the caring responsibilities that more often than not fall on to the shoulders of women, the inability that can come with that women often find in terms of accessing the networks that men take for granted, the informal networks from the golf clubs to the dinners after work that can be very difficult for women to access. And then, of course, there's the unconscious and at times still very conscious bias that women will face. Not to put too fine a point on it, women still face all too often blatant discrimination. You know, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission found that more than 50,000 women a year in this country are forced out of work in the UK because they become pregnant or they become mothers. That kind of discrimination is not acceptable. It's never been acceptable, but it's no longer acceptable, and we've got to continue to work to eradicate it. I mentioned earlier on some of the practical things we've got to do. Childcare, one of the key ambitions of the government I lead is to transform the provision of childcare to make it much more accessible and affordable for parents, mothers in particular. Also, as it happens, helps to give young people the best start in life, which for our educational opportunities is transformational as well. Forcing the pace of change in the boardrooms by having the public sector lead by example. Encouraging more women into STEM subjects by making more modern apprenticeships available in these areas for women. Piloting, as we're about to, the notion of returnship, something that's been very successful in America. Supporting women who've taken a career break, maybe to have children, to come back into the workplace. So there's all sorts of things that we need to do at a practical as well as at a cultural level. And I think sport is particularly important to all of this, because I think sport's got a double role to play here. Yes, it's got the responsibility, like any other walk of life, to play its part in tackling gender inequality and ensuring equal representation in decision making. But there's something about sport as well, about lifting and boosting confidence, about the lifting and boosting the confidence of women, so that it's not just confidence as athletes and sports women, but confidence that helps in other walks of life as well. Which is why I think it's so fantastic that companies like Aberdeen Asset Management are now sponsoring both women and men's sporting events, which is a clear and very tangible sign that they value both of them. And it's also, I have to say, why I'm so delighted today to be announcing that IMG, the leading events firm, is going to be working with us to deliver the 2019 Solheim Cup at Gleneagles, which is going to be fantastic for Scotland, for golf in Scotland, but also for the women's game of golf, to have that major championship played here in our country. It helps to put the spotlight on top athletes performing at the height of their game and make sure we have those role models where we need them. And we've got a fantastic role model here in Scotland, of course, in golf, in our own Katrina Matthews, who just today has been announced as the vice-captain of the European team for the next Solheim Cup, when hopefully that beautiful trophy, which I was getting my photograph taken with earlier on, the only time I'm going to hold a major sporting trophy, very heavy it was too, but hopefully Katrina and our colleagues will return that beautiful trophy to Europe in the next Solheim Cup. So sport, I think, has a transformational effect in building confidence as well as contributing to this overall imperative of gender equality. I hope I've given you the sense today that tackling gender inequality and promoting equality is something I feel very passionate about. As a woman, I feel passionate about it, but as First Minister, I feel passionate about it as well, because harnessing the ability and the potential of everybody in the country is key to making sure we can be as successful as we need to be as a country. And we've all got a role to play in this. And something else I feel very strongly about is that the battle for gender equality is not just the responsibility of women. Because gender equality is not just important for women, it is, as I've said, important for society as a whole. So for the men in the audience, for every man out there in a position of influence, it's your job too. Because while men continue to hold many of the positions of influence and decision making, it's really important that you exercise those positions in a way that supports, promotes, and doesn't undermine or frustrate gender equality. So it's everybody's responsibility, and we can all play our part in doing it. I started off by talking about Theresa May being the second female Prime Minister of the UK. And I saw, as many of you will have, because there's been lots of pictures of this in the media in recent days, but I saw a picture the other day of Margaret Thatcher surrounded by her first cabinet back in 1979. And back then, I'm sure there was a lot of women who thought the glass ceiling had been shattered when Mrs. Thatcher became Prime Minister. But actually, nothing could have been further from the truth. In 11 years as Prime Minister, Mrs. Thatcher appointed just one other woman to cabinet. I don't think she ever openly acknowledged that women actually needed help with childcare or education to be able to follow in her footsteps. In many ways, and it's often been said about Mrs. Thatcher, that instead of extending the ladder of opportunity, she pulled it up behind her. Now, in fairness to her, that was some years ago. Now we've got an opportunity, and those of us in positions of responsibility have got an opportunity, but more than that, we have a responsibility and a duty to make sure we don't pull that ladder up behind us. We do everything we can to extend it and open the way for more women to follow into our footsteps. I want to finish just with two reflections, two stories, one personal and one that I saw in the same way that many of you will have seen in the last couple of weeks. But I'm telling these stories because both of them in their own way signify the challenges we still face, but also in their own way, they might give us, in a small sense, a measure of how we judge success in the future. The first of these stories relates to something I've already referred to. When I became First Minister and appointed a gender-balanced cabinet, it was a big story at the time, gender-balanced cabinet for the first time. At that time, Scotland was only, I think, one of only 3 countries in the world that had a gender-balanced cabinet. And I, in the days that followed that, got lots of emails and letters, some of them positive, some of them less so. But I was really struck by the number of emails and letters and messages I got. I have to say, many of them from women who asked me, how did I possibly know that all the women in my cabinet were there on merit? Nobody asked me how I knew all the men were there on merit. And of course my answer is, why wouldn't they be there on merit? Having a half of your cabinet women when half of the population are women doesn't seem to me to be remarkable. So that's a sign of the challenge we still face. And maybe the sign of progress is in future, whenever a government leader or a business leader has a cabinet or a board that's not got at least half of its members women, people will say, how do we know that all the men are there on merit? Because half of the population are underrepresented. So that, perhaps, when we get to that stage, will be a sign that we really have started to reach the destination. And the second story, again, it's one that many of you will have seen last week or the week before, when Serena Williams won her latest Wimbledon title. And she was being interviewed after it, and the journalist who was interviewing her asked her how it felt to be one of the greatest female athletes of all time. And I thought her answer was absolutely perfect. She said that she preferred to be known simply as one of the greatest athletes of all time. And again, when we get to the day where we don't talk about female first ministers or female prime ministers or female athletes, we just talk about first ministers, prime ministers, and fantastic athletes, that's when we'll know that we finally cracked that literal glass ceiling that is above me. So, to sum up before we get into the discussion that's the most important part of the afternoon, I, as a 46-year-old woman, something that still pains me to say, I think we are living in a time now where we're closer to making the ultimate breakthroughs, so that, as I've always said, is a personal ambition of mine, and others who are mothers or aunties or grannies will share this. My 10-year-old niece, by the time she's entering womanhood and making the choices that will define her life, my fervent hope is that all these things we'll be talking about today are just a thing of the past, not battles that she and her generation are still fighting. I think we are tantalisingly close to that, but there's still a way to go. And often, with any journey, whatever it might be, it's the last few steps that can be the hardest. So let's keep powering on and make sure that by the time Harriet, my niece, and her generation are standing up here doing things like this, we're talking about these things as features of history, not as current battles. Thank you very much indeed for listening. I look forward to our discussion.